to the Center of the Earth read through. So if you didn't remember the Welcome back. I'm Jason. This is Nightly Reads, and we are on the fourth episode of our read through of Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. If you don't remember the where we left off at the last episode, our brave adventurers just made it to the summit of Mount Sneffels and are about to just descend into the crater and get a good night's rest. So we're going to pick up where we left off on chapter 13 and go from there. So thank you again for coming in, and let's get started. Chapter 13, The Shadow of Cathartus. Our supper was eaten with ease and rapidity, after which everybody did the best he could for himself within the hollow of the crater. The bed was hard, the shelter unsatisfactory, the situation painful, laying in the open air 5,000 feet above the level of the sea. Nevertheless, it has seldom happened to me that to sleep so well as I did on that particular night. I did not even dream. So much for the effects of what my uncle called wholesome fatigue. The next day we awoke under the rays of a bright and glorious sun. We were nearly frozen by the keen air. I left my granite couch and made one of the party to enjoy a view of the magnificent spectacle which has developed itself panorama-like at our feet. I stood upon the lofty summit of Mt Sneffels' southern peak. Thence I was able to obtain a view of the greater part of the island. The optical delusion common to all lofty heights raised the shores of the island, while the central portions appeared depressed. It was by no means too great a flight of fancy to believe that a giant picture was stretched out before me. I could see the deep valleys that crossed each other in every direction. I could see precipices looking like the sides of wells, lakes that seemed to be changed into ponds, ponds that looked like puddles, and rivers that were transformed into petty brooks. To my right were the glaciers upon glaciers and multiplied peaks topped with light clouds of smoke. The undulation of these infinite numbers of mountains, whose snowy summits make them look as if covered by foam, recalled to my remembrance the surface of a storm-beaten ocean. If I looked towards the west, the ocean lay before me in all its majestic grandeur, a continuation, as it were, of these fleecy hilltops. Where the earth ended and the sea began, it was impossible for the eye to distinguish. I soon felt that strange and mysterious sensation which is awakened in the mind when looking down from lofty hilltops, and now I was able to do so without any feeling of nervousness, having fortunately hardened myself to that kind of sublime contemplation. I wholly forgot who I was and where I was. I became intoxicated with a sense of lofty sublimity, without thought of the abysses to which my daring was about to soon plunge me. I was presently, however, brought back to the realities of my life by the arrival of the professor and Hans, who joined me at the lofty summit of the peak. My uncle, turning in a westerly direction, pointed out to me a light cloud of vapor, a kind of haze with a faint outline of land riding out of the waters. Greenland, he said. Greenland, I replied. Yes, continued my uncle, who was always explaining anything, spoke as if he were in a professor's chair. We are not merely more than 35 leagues distant from that wonderful land. When the great annual breakup of ice takes place, white bears come over to Iceland, carried by the floating masses of ice from the north. This, however, is a matter of little consequences. We are now on the summit of the transcendent Sneffels, and here are its two peaks, north and south. Hans will tell you that the name by which the people of Iceland call that on which we stand. My uncle turned to the imperturbable guide who nodded and spoke as usual with one word: Scartaris. My uncle looked at me with a proud and triumphant glance. A crater, he said. You hear? I did hear, but it was totally unable to make a reply. The crater of Mt Sneffels represented an inverted cone, the gaping orifice, apparently half a mile across, the depth infinite feet. Conceive that this hole must have been Conceive what this hole must have been like when full of flame and thunder and lightning. The bottom of the funnel-shaped hollow was about 500 feet in circumference, by which it will be seen the slope from the summit to the bottom was very gradual, and we were therefore clearly able to get there without much fatigue or difficulty. Involuntarily, I compared this crater to an enormous loaded cannon, and the comparison completely terrified me. To descend into the interior of a cannon, I thought to myself, when perhaps it is loaded and will go off at the least shock, is the act of a madman. But there was no longer any opportunity for me to hesitate. Hans, with perfectly calm and indifferent air, took his usual post at the head of our adventurous little band. I followed without uttering a syllable. I felt like a lamb led to slaughter. In order to render the descent less difficult, Hans took his way down the interior of the cone in rather a zigzag fashion, making, as the sailors say, long tracks to the eastward, followed by equally long ones to the west. It was necessary to walk through the midst of eruptive rocks, some of which, shaken in their balance, went rolling down the thundering clamor to the bottom of the abyss. These continual falls awoke echoes of a singular power and effect. Many portions of the cone consisted of inferior glaciers. Hans, whenever met with one of those obstacles, advanced with a great show of precaution, sounding the soil with his long iron pole in order to discover fissures and layers of deep, soft snow. In many doubtful and dangerous places, it became necessary for us to be tied together by a long rope in order that, should any of us be unfortunate enough to slip, he would be supported by his companions. This connecting link was doubtless a prudent precaution, but not by any means unintended with danger. Nevertheless, and despite all manifold difficulties of the descent, along slopes with which our guide was wholly unacquainted, we made considerable progress without accident. One of our great parcels of rope slipped from one of the Iceland porters and rushed by a short cut to the bottom of the abyss. By midday, we were at the end of our journey. I looked upwards and saw only the upper orifice of the cone, which served as a circular frame to a very, very small portion of sky, a portion which seemed to me singularly beautiful should I ever again graze upon that lovely sunlit sky. The only exception to this extraordinary landscape was the peak of Scartaris, which seemed lost in the great void of the heavens. The bottom of the crater was composed of 3 separate shafts through which, during periods of eruption, when Sneffels was in action, the great central furnace sent forth its burning lava and poisonous vapors. Each of these chimneys or shafts gaped open-mouthed in our path. I kept as far away from them as possible, not even venturing to take the faintest peep downwards. As for the professor, after a rapid examination of their disposition and characteristics, he became breathless and panting. He ran from one to the other like a delighted schoolboy, gesticulating wildly and uttering incomprehensible and disjointed phrases in all sorts of languages. Hans, the guide, and his humbler companions seated themselves on some piles of lava and looked silently on. They clearly took my uncle for a lunatic, and awaited the result. Suddenly the professor uttered a wild, unearthly cry. At first I imagined he had lost his footing and was falling headlong into one of the yawning gulfs. Nothing of the kind. I saw him, his arms spread out over to their widest extent, his legs stretched apart, standing upright before an enormous pedestal, high enough and black enough to bear a gigantic statue of Pluto. His attitude and mine were that of a man utterly stupefied. But his stupefaction was speedily changed to the wildest joy. "Harry, Harry, come here!" he cried. "Make haste! Wonderful! Wonderful!" Unable to understand what he meant, I turned to obey his commands. Neither Hans nor the other Icelanders moved a step. "Look," said the professor, in something of the manner of the French general pointing to the pyramids, pointing out the pyramids to his army. And fully partaking his stupefaction, if not his joy, I read on the eastern side of the huge rock of the stone the same characters, half eaten away by corrosive action of time. The name, to me 1,000 times accursed. "Arne Saknussemm," cried my uncle. "Now, unbeliever, do you begin to have faith?" It was totally impossible for me to answer a single word. I went back to my pile of lava in a state of silent awe. The evidence was unanswerable, overwhelming. In a few moments, however, my thoughts were far away, back in my German home with Gretchen and the old cook. What I would have given for one of my cousin's smile, for one of the ancient domestic omelets, or for my own feather bed. How long I remained in this state I do not know. All I can say is that when I last raised my head from between my hands, there remained at the bottom of the crater only myself, my uncle, and Hans. The Icelandic porters had been dismissed and were now descending the exterior slopes of Mt Sneffels, on their way to Stapi. How heartily did I wish myself with them! Hans slept tranquilly on the foot of a rock in a kind of rill of lava, where he made himself a rough and ready bed. My uncle was walking about the bottom of the crater like a wild beast in a cage. I had no desire, neither had I the strength, to move from my recumbent position. Taking example by the guide, I gave way to a kind of peaceful solemnity, during which I seemed to both hear and feel continued heavings and shudderings in the mountain. In this way we passed our first night in the interior of the crater. The next morning, a gray, cloudy, heavy sky hung like a funeral pall over the summit of the volcanic cone. I did not notice it so much from the obscurity that reigned around us as from the rage with which my uncle was devoured. I fully understood the reason, and again a glimpse of hope made my heart leap with joy. I will briefly explain the cause. One of the 3 openings which yawned beneath our steps, only one could have been followed by the adventurous Saknussemm. According to the words of the learned Icelander, it was only to be known by that one particular mentioned in the cryptograph, that the shadow of Scartaris fell upon it, just touching its mouth in the last days of the month of June. We were, in fact, to consider the pointed peak as the stylus of an immense sundial, the shadow of which pointed on one given day, like the inexorable finger of fate, to the yawning chasm which led to the interior of the earth. Now, as often happens in these regions, should the sun fail to burst through the clouds, no shadow. Consequently, no chance of discovering the right aperture. We had already reached the 25th of June. If the kindly heavens would only remain densely clouded for 6 more days, we should have to put off our voyage of discovery for another year. Certainly there would be one person fewer in the party. I already had sufficient of the mad and the monstrous enterprise. It would be utterly impossible to depict the impotent rage of Professor Hardwigg. The day passed away, and not the faintest outline of shadow could be seen at the bottom of the crater. Hans the guide never moved from his place. He must have been curious to know what we were about, if indeed he could believe we were about anything. As for my uncle, he never addressed a word to me. He was nursing his wrath to keep it warm, his eyes fixed on the black and foggy atmosphere, his complexion hideous with suppressed passion. Never had his eyes appeared so fierce, his nose so aquiline, his mouth so hard and firm. On the 26th, no change for the better. A mixture of rain and snow fell during the whole day. Hans very quietly built himself a hut of lava into which he retired like uh, Diogenes from his tub. It took a malicious I took a malicious delight in watching the thousand little cascades that flowed down from the side of the cone, carrying with them at times a stream of stones into the vastly deep below. My uncle was almost frantic. To be sure, it was enough to make even a patient man angry. He had reached into a certain extent of the goal of his desires, and yet he was likely to be wrecked in port. But if the heavens and the elements are capable of causing us much pain and sorrow, there are two sides to a medal, and there was reserved for Professor Hardwick a brilliant and sudden surprise which to compensate him for all of his sufferings. The next day the sky was still overcast, but on Sunday, the 28th, the last day but of 2 of the month, with a sudden change of wind and a new moon, there came a change of weather. The sun poured its beaming rays to the very bottom of the crater. Each hillock, each rock, every stone, every asperity of the soil had its share in the luminous effulgence, and its shadow fell heavily on the soil. Among others, to his insane delight, the shadow of Scotaris was marked and clear, and moved slowly with the radiant start of the day. My uncle moved with it in a state of mental ecstasy. At 12 o'clock exactly, when the sun had attained its highest altitude for the day, the shadow fell upon the edge of the center pit. "Here it is!" gasped the professor in an agony of joy. "Here it is! We have found it! Forward, my friends, into the interior of the earth!" I looked curiously at Hans to see what reply he would make of this terrific announcement. "For it," he said tranquilly. "Forward it is," answered my uncle, who was now in the seventh heaven of delight. When we were quite ready, our watches indicated 13 minutes past 1. Chapter 14. The real journey commences. Our real journey had now commenced. Hitherto our courage and our determination had overcome all difficulties. We were fatigued at times, and that was all. Now that we were about to encounter unknown and fearful dangers, I had not as yet ventured to take a glimpse down the horrible abyss into which a few minutes more I was about to plunge. The fatal moments had, however, at last arrived. I had still the option of refusing or accepting a share of this foolish and audacious enterprise. But I was ashamed to show more fear than the eiderduck hunter. Hans seemed to accept the difficulties of the journey so tranquilly, with such calm indifference, with such perfect recklessness of all the danger, that I am actually blushed to appear less of a man than he. Had I been alone with my uncle, I should certainly have sat down and argued the point fully, but in the presence of the guide, I held my tongue. I gave one moment to the thought of my charming cousin, and then I advanced into the mouth of the central shaft. It measured about 100 feet in diameter, which made about 300 feet in circumference. I leaned over a rock which stood on its edge and looked down. My hair stood on end, my teeth chattered, my limbs trembled. I seemed utterly to lose my center of gravity, while my head was in a sort of whirl, like that of a drunken man. There was nothing more powerful than this attraction towards the abyss. I was about to fall headlong into the gaping well when I was drawn back by a firm and powerful hand. It was that of Hans. I had not taken lessons enough at the Frelsers Kirk of Copenhagen in the art of looking down from lofty eminences without blinking. However, few as the minutes were during which I gazed down the tremendous and even wondrous shaft, I had sufficient glimpse of it to give me an idea of its physical conformation. Its sides, which were almost as perpendicular as those of the well, presented numerous projections which doubtless would assist our descent. It was a sort of wild and savage staircase without banister or fence. A rope fastened above near the surface would certainly support our weight and enable us to reach the bottom. But how, when we had arrived at its utmost depth, were we to loosen it above? This was, I thought, a question of some importance. My uncle, however, was one of those men who nearly always prepared with expedients. He hit upon a very simple method of obviating this difficulty. He unrolled a cord about as thick as my thumb and at least 400 feet in length. He allowed about half of it to go in the pit and catch a hitch over a great block of lava which stood on the edge of the precipice. This done, he threw the second half after the first. Each of us could now descend by catching the two cords in one hand when about 200 feet below. All the explorer had to do was let go of one end and pull away the other, when the cord would come falling at his feet. In order to go down further, all that was necessary was to continue the same operation. This was a very excellent proposition, and no doubt a correct one. Going down appeared to me easy enough. It was the coming up again that now occupied my thoughts. Now, said my uncle, as soon as he had completed this important preparation, let us see about the baggage. It must be divided into 3 separate parcels, and each of us must carry one on his back. I allude to the more important and fragile articles. My worthy and ingenious uncle did not appear to consider that we came under this denomination. Hans, he continued, you will take the charge of the tools and some of the provisions. You, Harry, must take the possession of another third of the provisions and the arms. I will load myself with the rest of the eatables and the more delicate instruments. But, I explained, our clothes, this massive cord and ladders, who will undertake and carry them down? They will go down themselves. And how so? I asked. You shall see. My uncle was not fond of half measures, nor did he like anything in the way of hesitation. Giving his orders to Hans, he had the whole of the non-fragile articles made up of the bundle, and the packet, firmly and solidly fastened, was simply pitched over the edge of the gulf. I heard the moaning of the suddenly displaced air and the noise of falling stones. My uncle, leaning over the abyss, followed the descent of his luggage with perfectly self-satisfied air, and did not rise until it had completely disappeared from sight. Now then, he cried, it is our turn. I put in good faith into any man of common sense. Was it possible to hear this energetic cry without a shudder? The professor fastened his case of instruments on his back. Hans took charge of the tools, I of the arms. The descent then commenced in the following order. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I went last. Our progress was made in profound silence, a silence only troubled by the fall of pieces of rock, which, breaking from the jagged sides, fell with a roar to the depths below. I allowed myself to slide, so to speak, holding frantically onto the double cord with one hand, and with the other keeping myself off the rocks by assistance of my iron-shod pole. One idea was all the time impressed upon my brain. I feared that the upper support would fail me. The cord appeared to me far too fragile to bear the weight of 3 such persons as we were with our luggage. I made as little use of it as possible, trusting on my own agility, doing miracles in the way of feats of dexterity and strength upon the projecting shelves and spurs of lava, which my feet seemed to clutch as strongly as my hands. The guide went first, and I have said, and when one of the slippery and frail supports broke from under his feet, he had recourse to his usual monosyllabic way of speaking. Giffark! Attention, look out, repeated my uncle. In about half an hour we reached a kind of small terrace formed by a fragment of rock projecting some distance from the sides of the shaft. Hans now began to haul up the cord on one side only, the other going up as quietly as the other came down. It fell at last, bringing with it a shower of small stones, lava, and dust. It say, disagreeable kind of rain or hail. While we were seated on this extraordinary bench, I ventured once more to look downwards. With a sigh, I discovered that the bottom was still wholly invisible. Were we then going directly to the interior of the earth? The performance with the cord recommended, and a quarter of an hour later we had reached the depth of another 200 feet. I have very strong doubts if the most determined geologist would, during that descent, have studied the nature of the different layers of the earth around him. I did not trouble my head much about the matter. Whether we were among the combustible carbon or primitive soil, I neither knew or cared to know. Not so the ineverate professor. He must have taken notes all the way down, for at one of our halts he began to brief lecture. The further we advance, said he, the greater is my confidence in the result. The disposition of these volcanic strata absolutely confirms the theories of Sir Humphrey Davy. We are still within the region of the primordial soil, the soil which took place, the chemical operation of metals becoming inflamed by coming in contact with the air and water. I at once regret the old and now forever exploded theory of a central fire. At all events, we shall soon know the truth. Such was the everlasting conclusion to which he came. I, however, was very far from being in humor to discuss the matter. I had something else to think of. My silence was taken for consent, and we still continued to go down. At the expiration of 3 hours, we were, to all appearance, as far off from ever as from the bottom of the well. When I looked upwards, however, I could see the upper orifice was every minute decreasing in size. The sides of the shaft were getting closer and closer together. We were approaching the regions of eternal night. And still we continued to descend. At length I noticed that when pieces of stone were detached from the sides of this stupendous precipice, they were swallowed up by less noise than before. The final sound was sooner heard. We were approaching the bottom of the abyss. As I had been very careful to keep account of all the changes of chord which took place, I was able to tell exactly what was the depth we had reached, as well the time it had taken. We had shifted the rope 28 times, each operation taking a quarter of an hour, which in all made 7 hours. To this had to be added 28 pauses. In all, 10 hours and a half. We started at 1. It was now, therefore, 11 o'clock at night. It does not require a great knowledge of the arithmetic to know that 28 times 200 feet make 5,600 feet, more than an English mile. While I was making this mental calculation, a voice broke the silence. It was the voice of Hans. "Halt!" he cried. I checked myself very suddenly at the moment I was about to kick my uncle in the head. "We have reached the end of our journey," said the worthy professor in a satisfied tone. "What, the interior of the earth?" said I, slipping down to his side. "No, you stupid fellow, but we have reached the bottom of the well." "And I suppose there is no further progress to be made?" I hopefully exclaimed. "Oh, yes, I can dimly see a sort of tunnel which turns off obliquely to the right. At all events, we must see about that tomorrow. Let us sup now and seek slumber as best we may." I thought it time, but made no observations on that point. I was fairly launched into a desperate course, and all I had to do was go forward hopefully and trustingly. It was not even now quite dark, and light filtering down in a most extraordinary manner. We opened the provision bag, ate a frugal supper, and each did his best to find a bed amid the pile of stones, dirt, and lava which accumulated for ages at the bottom of the shaft. I happened to grope out the pile of ropes, ladders, and clothes which we had thrown down, and upon them I stretched myself. After such a day's labor, my rough bed seemed as soft as down. For a while I lay in a sort of pleasant trance. Presently, after laying quietly for some minutes, I opened my eyes and looked upwards. As I did so, I made out a brilliant little dot at the extremity of this long, gigantic telescope. It was a star without scintillating rays. According to my calculation, it must be Beta in the constellation of the Little Bear. After this little bit of astronomical recreation, I dropped into a sound sleep. Chapter 15. We continue our descent. At 8 o'clock in the morning, a faint kind of dawn of day woke us. The 1,001 prisms of the lava collected in light as it passed and brought it to us like a shower of sparkles. We were able to with ease see objects around us. "Well, Harry, my boy," cried the delighted professor, rubbing his hands together, "what do you say now? Did you ever pass a more tranquil night in our house in the Krogenhaus? Kongenstrasse? Sorry. No deafening sounds of cartwheels, no cries of hawkers, no bad language from boatmen or watermen." "Well, uncle, we are quite at the bottom of this well, but to me there is something terrible in this calm." "Why?" said the professor hotly. "One would say you were already beginning to be afraid. How will you get on presently? Do you know that as yet we have not penetrated 1 inch into the bowels of the earth?" "What can you mean, sir?" was my bewildered and astonished reply. "I mean to say that we have only just reached the soil of the island itself. This long vertical tube, which ends at the bottom of the crater of Sneffels, ceases here just about on level with the sea." "Are you sure, sir?" "Quite sure. Consult the barometer." It was quite true that the mercury, after rising gradually in the instrument, as long as our descent was taking place, had stopped precisely at 29 degrees. "You perceive," said the professor, "we have as yet to only endure the pressure of air. I am curious to replace the barometer with the manometer." The barometer, in fact, was about to become useless as soon as the weight of the air was greater than what was calculated above sea level of the ocean. "But," I said, "it is not very much to be feared that this ever-increasing pressure may not in the end turn out very painful and inconvenient." "No," said he, "we shall descend very slowly, and our lungs will be gradually accustomed to breathe the compressed air. It is well known that aeronauts have gone so high as to be nearly without air at all. Why, then, should we not accustom ourselves to breathe when we have, say, too little too much of it? For myself, I am certain I shall prefer it. Let us not lose a moment. There is a packet which preceded us in our descent." I smilingly pointed out to my uncle. Hans had not seen it, and I believed it caught somewhere above us. "Upe," he had phrased it. "Now," said my uncle, "let us breakfast, and break fast like people who have long days' work before them." Biscuit and dried meat washed down by some mouthfuls of water flavored with shreddam was the material of our luxurious meal. As soon as it was finished, my uncle took from his pocket a notebook destined to be filled by the memoranda of our travels. He had already placed his instruments in order, and with this he wrote: "Monday, June 29th. Chronometer, 8 hours, 17 minutes. Morning. Barometer, 29.6 inches. Thermometer, 6 degrees, 43 degrees Fahrenheit. Direction, east by southeast." This last observation referred to the obscure gallery and was indicated to us by the compass. "Now, Harry," cried the professor in an enthusiastic tone of voice, "we are truly about to take our first step into the interior of the earth, never before visited by man since first creation of the world. You may consider, therefore, that this precise moment our travels really commence. As my uncle made this remark, he took in one hand the Ruckaroff coil apparatus which hung around his neck, and with the other he put the electric current into communication with the worm of the lantern, and a bright light at once illuminated that dark and gloomy tunnel. The effect was magical. Hans, who carried the second apparatus, had it also put into operation. This ingenious application of electricity to practical purposes enabled us to move along by the light of an artificial day amid even the flow of the most inflammable and combustible gases. "Forward!" cried my uncle, to which he took up his burden. Hans went first, my uncle followed, and I going third, we entered the somber gallery. Just as we were about to engulf ourselves with this dismal passage, I lifted up my head and through the tube-like shaft saw that Icelandic sky that I was never to see again. Was it the last I should ever see of any sky? The stream of lava flowing from the bowels of the earth in 1219 had forced itself a passage through the tunnel. It lined the whole of the inside of its thick, brilliant coating. The electric light added very greatly to the brilliancy of this effect. The great difficulty of our journey now began. How were we to prevent ourselves from slipping down the steeply inclined plane? Happily, some cracks, abrasures of the soil, and other irregularities served as the place of steps, and we descended slowly, allowing our heavy luggage to slip on before at the end of a long cord. But that which served as steps under our feet became in other places stalactites. The lava, very porous in certain places, took the form of little round blisters, crystals of opaque quartz, adorned with limpid drops of natural glass suspended to the roof like lustres, seemed to take fire as we passed beneath them. One would have fancied that the genii of romance were illuminating their underground palaces to receive the sons of men. "Magnificent! Glorious!" I cried in a moment of involuntary enthusiasm. "What a spectacle, uncle! Do you not admire these variegated shades of lava which run through the whole series of colors, from reddish brown to pale yellow, by the most insensible degrees? And these crystals, they appear like luminous globes." "You are beginning to see the charms of travel, Master Harry," cried my uncle. "Wait a bit, we will advance further. What we have yet discovered is nothing. Onwards, my boy, onwards." It would have been far more correct and appropriate expression had he said, "Let us slide," for we were going down an inclined plane with perfect ease. The compass indicated that we were moving in a southeasterly direction. The flow of lava had never turned right or left. It had inflexibility of a straight line. Nevertheless, to my surprise, we found no perceptible increase in heat. This proved the theories of Humphrey Davy to be founded on truth, and more than once I found myself examining the thermometer in silent astonishment. 2 hours after our departure, it only marked 45 degrees Fahrenheit. I had every reason to believe that our descent was far from horizontal than vertical. As for discovering the exact depth to which we had attained, nothing could be easier. The professor, as he advanced, measured the angles of deviation and inclination, but he kept the result of his observations to himself. About 8 o'clock in the evening, my uncle gave the signal for halting. Hans seated himself on the ground. The lamps were hung to fissures in the lava rock, and we were now in a large cavern where air was not wanting. On the contrary, it abounded. What could be the cause of this? To what atmospheric agitation could be ascribed this drop? But this was a question which I did not care to discuss just then. Fatigue and hunger made me incapable of reasoning. An unceasing march of 7 hours had not been kept up without great exhaustion. I was really and truly worn out, and delighted enough I was to hear the word halt. Hans laid out some provisions on a lump of lava, and we each supped with keen relish. One thing, however, caused us great uneasiness. Our water reserve was already half exhausted. My uncle had full confidence in finding subterranean resources, but hitherto we had completely failed in doing so. I could not help calling my uncle's attention to the circumstance. "And you are surprised at this total absence of springs?" he said. "Doubtless. I am very uneasy on the point. We have certainly not enough water to last us 5 days." "Be quite easy on that matter," continued my uncle. I answer for it we shall find plenty of water. In fact, far more than we shall want." "But when?" "When we once get through the crust of lava, how could you expect springs to force their way through these solid stone walls?" "But what is there to prove that this concrete mass of lava does not extend to the center of the earth? I don't think we have yet done as much in a vertical way." "What puts that into your head, my boy?" asked my uncle mildly. "Well, it appears to me that if we had descended very far below the level of the sea, we should find it rather hotter than we have." "According to your system," said my uncle. "But what does the thermometer say?" "Scarcely 15 degrees by Ruminar, which is only an increase of 9 since our departure." "Well, and what conclusion does that bring you to?" inquired the professor. "The deduction I draw from this is very simple. According to the most exact observation, the augmentation of the temperature of the interior of the earth is 1 degree for every 100 feet, but certain local causes may considerably modify this figure. Thus, at Yokost in Siberia, it has been remarked that heat increases a degree every 36 feet. The difference evidently depends on the conductibility of certain rocks. In the neighborhood of an extinct volcano, it has been remarked that the elevation of temperature was only 1 degree in every 50 and 5 and 20 feet. Let us then go upon the calculations, which is the most favorable, and calculate." "Well, calculate away, my boy." "Nothing easier," said I, pulling out my notebook and pencil. 9 times 125 feet make a depth of 1,125 feet. Archimedes could not have spoken more geometrically. Well, according to my observations, we are at least 10,000 feet below the level of the sea." "Can it be possible?" "Either my calculation is correct, or there is no truth in figures." The calculations of the professor were perfectly correct. We were already 6,000 feet deeper down in the bowels of the earth than anyone had ever been before. The lowest known depth to which man had hitherto penetrated was in the mines of Kitzbühel in the Tyrol, and those of Württemberg. The temperature, which should have been 81, was in this place only 15. This was a matter for serious consideration. And that is the end of chapter 15, which should put us right about an hour. So I'm going to go ahead and end it there. And we will continue our travels with our wonderful adventurous party in the next episode. You guys have a good night.